What I'm going to try to lay out here is a basic introduction to electrophysiology for paramedic students. This is intended to be the first step in formal EKG education. The goal is to work toward developing an intuitive understanding of how EKGs work, or more specifically, what the physiological processes are that lead to the EKG tracings we see in the real world. I'm assuming a basic understanding of both cardiac and general physiology, but I'm going to hit some specifics that are directly relevant. There are going to be some generalizations here, but I'm doing my best to make sure the information presented is accurate, and most importantly, the goal is to prime the audience for more advanced discussion in the future. Let's ask a really fundamental question. What is a heart for? The heart is a very specialized organ. It does only one thing: move blood. The heart's goal is to get the blood that's in it to go somewhere else. It serves no other function. But that function is so important that if a heart stops, its host organism dies nearly immediately. Heart stoppage is probably the most common definition of death. There is a huge amount of selective pressure on hearts to do their job efficiently and stably for this reason. The oldest cardiovascular systems in the fossil record date back 520 million years. So, for twice as long as there have been mammals and 5 times as long as there have been humans, there have been hearts. The next question I want to ask is, after 500 million years of refinement, what are the adaptations that have led to a modern heart? First, let's talk about some of the things that make cardiomyocytes, heart muscle cells, different on a cellular level than, say, skeletal muscle cells. We're using skeletal muscle cells because I think that is the most comfortable, intuitive comparison. Fundamentally, there are some structural differences. Those are not going to be hugely pertinent to what we're talking about today in electrophysiology, but they're very important to general cardiology, and maybe at some point in the future we'll take a deep dive on that. One of the first big electrical differences is the idea of cell-to-cell communication. Cardiomyocytes are coupled to their neighbors. What this means is that when a cardiac muscle cell depolarizes, that impulse continues to the other cells next to it, and that wave cascades down the rest of the heart. So, all you need to do to get a heart to beat, is to get one cell to depolarize. Skeletal muscle cells can't do this because if they did, you wouldn't have any fine motor control. To be able to make your arm do what you want on demand, you have to have the ability to start and stop contraction on demand. Growing directly out of that idea is the idea of persistent contraction. Once a cardiomyocyte depolarizes, it stays depolarized and, in theory, contracted for a fixed period of time, about 200 milliseconds. Skeletal muscles will repolarize in as little as 2 milliseconds if they don't continue to receive nerve instruction. Again, if your skeletal muscles had to work with fixed depolarization, you wouldn't be able to have anything approaching fine motor control. We're not going to belabor this idea now. We'll come back to it in great depth in the future, but what you can see here are graphs comparing the action potentials and contractile characteristics of a skeletal muscle cell and a cardiac muscle cell. You can think of the action potential as an EKG of one cell, but there's a huge asterisk next to that. Again, we'll come back to this idea in a future presentation. What I do want you to see here is how both the electrical component, that's the action potential, and the tension component take longer in a cardiomyocyte. That's not an inefficiency, it's actually quite the opposite. Finally, we're going to talk about the idea of automaticity. Automaticity is the idea that a cell will depolarize on its own without any outside input. Of course, skeletal muscle can't do this. If it did, you would regularly punch yourself in the face. Now, at one point in time, I feel like I was taught that all heart muscle cells had automaticity. This isn't true. It's actually only about 1% of cardiomyocytes that exhibit it. And those are the cells that are within the pacing system of the heart. Again, in the future, we'll go into this in more depth, but a thing that was a real light bulb moment for me was when I realized that pacemaker cells have a different shape to their action potentials. They're like sine waves, sort of. They build up, cascade over, build up again, all on their own. Now that we've talked about things on a cellular level, let's move out and talk about things on a macro structural level. This is a real-time MRI of a human heart. We're watching a heart beat in situ, in someone, presumably its owner's chest. This is a sagittal or longitudinal section that we're looking at. We can imagine that this patient has been cut down the midline or a little bit to the left of the midline and we're looking inward. Another way to think about this is imagining that we're looking through this person's left armpit. We'll start by identifying some structures. The large chamber on the bottom is the left ventricle. Immediately above it is the left atrium. We're seeing a little bit of a slice of the right ventricle here, and the right atrium is barely visible during diastole up over here. We also have the aorta, the large exit structure coming out of the left ventricle here. You can see the aortic valve right there. We can also see the pulmonary trunk behind the aorta. That's where the pulmonary arteries are joined together before they split to go right and left. And we can see some pulmonary vasculature over here. That's probably a pulmonary artery. We can also see a little bit down below. This is most likely a diaphragm. There could be some liver down there, but I think that's mostly diaphragm we're looking at. Clean this up a little bit so we can talk about it more. Let's watch for the point where the left atrium is the largest. That'll be the very end of diastole and our point for starting the cardiac cycle. What I'm interested in right now isn't so much the idea of how we follow blood moving through the heart. I'm more interested in the mechanical characteristics of how this heart beats. We can see that when the atria get to their largest, at that point they contract. The cells get smaller and therefore closer together. The walls of the chamber thicken. The whole chamber itself shrinks, so there's less volume in the chamber, so blood is forced down into the ventricles. One thing that I want us to appreciate, and this is kind of subtle in real time, is that the cells don't immediately relax after contracting. They stay contracted for a period of time, and this is what allows the blood to move down to the ventricles as much as possible. So there's a pause between atrial contraction and ventricular contraction to allow for the ventricles to fill maximally. If that pause weren't there, the whole system would become inoperable, incredibly inefficient. The chambers would be fighting against each other and the atria would lose that battle. Look up atrial cannon waves when you get a chance. After our necessary pause, the ventricles begin to contract. This should be much more obvious because the musculature is so much bigger. You can see the walls get thicker, they move closer together, and note again that they stay contracted for a period of time before relaxing. So, in summary, the heart starts by contracting at the top. It stays contracted for a moment while the blood is moving from the top to the bottom. Then the bottom contracts. It stays contracted for a while blood moves out to wherever it's going. And then we start again. Because of the special characteristics of cells in the heart that we talked about earlier, this whole sequence is reflected directly on the EKG. This heart right here is made up of about 3 billion cardiomyocytes. An EKG is the sum of all of the electrical signals of those 3 billion cells added together at once. The problem with our brains is that we're really good at counting to impossibly large numbers, but we're really bad at visualizing them. You can't visualize 3 billion of anything. So, as we start to move into EKGs, let's look at a heart that's only got a few dozen cells. Here we have a block model of a human heart. In this model, gray cells are contractile muscles and yellow cells are components of the heart's conduction system. They're broken into 3 areas. Up top, this group of 6 cells is representing the atria combined into one chamber. Because the atria are small, from both an electrical and a contractile force standpoint, we can get away with this. Then, down below, the ventricles are separate. The left ventricle is the most muscularly and electrically largest, and then the right ventricle is a little bit smaller. To name the components of the conduction system, up in the top right corner, right here, is the sinoatrial node, the SA node, and this is the normal pacemaker from the heart. So this is that one place where that one impulse originates to make the rest of the heart beat in a normal situation. The signal from the SA node propagates down to here, the atrioventricular node. The AV node is those wires connecting it are called the internodal pathways. There's another wire present in the atria in a real heart called Bachmann's bundle that connects the right and left atria together so they can contract at the same time. But because our atria is only a single chamber here, an atrium, if you will, we are omitting that in our model. Just below the AV node is the bundle of His, and then the bundle of His bifurcates into the left and right bundle branches, which are wires that wrap up through the ventricles. Let's start this heart beating and we'll see how it works. First, let's watch the impulses propagate through the conduction system. The yellow cells will turn red as the impulse moves through them. After the SA node fires, the signal moves quickly down through to the AV node where it gets stuck for a period of time, right here. Remember a minute ago when we said we have to make sure the atria contract before the ventricles start contracting? That's what the AV node is doing, ensuring blood has enough time to physically move from the atria down to the ventricles. So, after the AV node holds up that impulse, it then lets it through to the bundle of His and sends simultaneously down both bundle branches. One thing to start noticing right now is that the impulses move much more quickly through the conduction system, through the yellow cells, than they do through the muscle cells, the gray cells themselves. Let's focus in on what's going on in the atria. We're going to see a few color changes. When a cell's at rest, it's gray. When the cell starts depolarizing, it's blue. And when it has finished depolarizing, it is depolarized, it's green, and then it will transition back to gray. Watch how the energy is moving through our combined atrium. The top right cell is going to depolarize first, then its neighbors, then their neighbors, and then the final cell. This is the cell-to-cell communication we mentioned before. So, in the atria, the primary method of depolarization is cell-to-cell. How do the ventricles differ? Well, we've got these bundle branches down here, which mean the impulses are being spread through them much more quickly than in the cell-to-cell communication of the atria. Because the ventricles are bigger, we have more wiring to make for efficient, rapid contraction. We can get away without that in the atria because the contractile force is so small, but down in the ventricles, we need wiring to make these signal transmissions efficient. Now, let's talk about ways we might be able to measure this. The first thing, and maybe the easiest thing we can do, is to count. I'm going to cheat a little bit here, and I'm going to tell you that the only number we're interested in is the number of cells that are actively depolarizing, the cells that are blue. And this is because of the way the tools we use to measure an EKG work. So I can pause this animation at any point, possibly. And then we can count the number of blue cells that are there. So in this instance, we've got 3 up in the atria. Something else I can measure is the direction those depolarizations are going. So in our atrium, the impulses are moving down into the patient's left, right on the screen, but down into the left. When we get down to the ventricles, most of the energy is going down initially, and then we have a little bit of lateral movement, and then it starts to wrap upwards along the outside. I can combine those two values, the number and the direction, into a single metric called a vector. A vector is a number that has both an intensity and a direction. So in our model, that's going to be the number of blue cells and the direction that energy is moving. Those vectors are what we're actually measuring on an EKG. And in a future presentation, we'll look a lot more in depth into that phenomenon. But for the moment, understanding that what we're measuring is the intensity and the direction of electrical impulses through the heart in combination. So I now have a way to measure some of the electrical characteristics of this heart. Let's be nerds about it and graph it over time. This model is a little bit different. When a cell depolarizes, it's going to show us an arrow that points in the direction of the depolarization, so we can count the arrows as they light up. On our graph, we're going to do something that seems a little bit backwards. We're going to count the number of down arrows in the up direction on our graph. So the more down arrows that are lit up at once, the more positive our value will be. Up arrows will count as negative down arrows. So if we ever have more up than down, our graph will go below 0. I promise this will make more sense as soon as we get it started. One other thing, our graph is only going to count up and down. If we see any side-to-side movement, we don't count it. This isn't just hand waving. This is an actual phenomenon in the real world. Any energy that is perpendicular to our lead is going to be invisible to us from that lead. And again, we'll be a lot more in depth about that in the future. But for right now, we've got a pretty simple model. As we start this beating slowly, we can watch what happens in the atria. We said that our atrial depolarization happens down and to the left, so half of our energy is going down and half of it is going to the patient's left. We won't be counting that left component. So at this point where I've paused it, we have 1.5 down arrows because we have 3 half down arrows. And we can see that mapped on our tracing graph over here. As that impulse continues over the atria, we can watch what happens. So 3 cells are lit, giving us 1.5. Our maximal point is going to be 4 cells lit, giving us 2, and then it swoops back down. So the wave on the EKG created by the atria is this smooth, curved wave, and that's our initial depolarization of the atria. What happens next in the process? All of our atrial cells are green or almost green. There's no movement happening. So we get a period of nothing. We get a flat line on our tracing while that impulse is held up in the AV node. So this flat area on the EKG tracing after the immediate atrial depolarization reflects the pause that occurs within the AV node. Once that signal has moved down to the bundle of His, a bunch of things are going to happen. We've got one cell here that's going up. It depolarizes first, giving us a little downward deflection, but then the real stuff starts happening. So we've got a net of 1, a net of 5, a net of 8, a net of 9, 10, looks like there, at our peak. All of those cells are depolarizing simultaneously because the bundle branches have allowed those cells to fire at the same time. And then, as the impulse starts to wrap back up around the outside of the heart, we go negative for a little bit. We've got a period of time where there are some up arrows with no down arrows. And then finally, everything is depolarized, everything is green. This is the point where we want the heart to be contracted, forcing blood out, and we're back to our baseline here. That gives us another brief flat period, and then a final wave happens. So we've got nothing moving, and then that repolarization wave moves over the heart. So I've made a choice to not put any arrows on this because you actually need a much more complex model to arrive at the appropriate shape for this final repolarization wave. We really need a 3-dimensional model, and we'll get there at some point. But for the time being, I'm going to ask you to just trust me that the pattern that this repolarization makes looks something like that following the ventricular depolarization here, and then we end up back at the beginning. We'll let this cycle for a few times so you can watch it happen. So for right now, we're going to name this normal sinus rhythm. And that's because the pacing impulse, that one cell that fires first, is originating in the SA node, the sinoatrial node. And then everything that's happening after it is the stuff that we expect. That's what makes it normal sinus rhythm, at least for our purposes right now. I'm going to put a whole bunch of commentary on language with that a little bit later on. But for today, when it's a impulse originating in the SA node that's then propagating through the rest of the heart in the normal way at a normal rate, that's normal sinus rhythm. And this is what I want you to take away from today, this idea of how we arrive at a baseline expected EKG tracing. To wrap things up, let's look at some things that can go wrong, though, because really that's what makes everyone interested, right? So what happens if there's no electricity moving through the heart? How does that graph over time? Well, it's nothing. That's flatline. We call this one asystole because of the lack of systole. There are no arrows moving either up or down in our axis, that's asystole. Okay, so that's total nothingness. How about something a little bit more subtle? What happens if the AV node holds on to an impulse for too long before it releases it into the ventricles? What part of the EKG tracing is going to change? P wave is going to be normal. That's our first depolarization. But then the spot, the flat area between the atrial depolarization and the ventricular depolarization is going to get a little bit too long. We call that the PR segment. We're not going to stress about naming waves and pieces today, but that little bit stretches out. And this is what we call an AV block. When that period of time is just lengthened, we call that a first through AV block. And that reflects some sort of disease process within the AV node that's causing it to take too long to propagate that signal. Finally, let's look at some changes in the muscular tissue itself and see how that can affect our tracing. This atrium has 3 more cells than our normal one. How's the tracing going to change? Our P wave got taller and it got a little bit pointier too. And that's because more cells are firing at once, and that's causing us to have an increased amplitude, an increased height over the same period of time. So it got taller and it got a little bit pointier. This is what we call atrial hypertrophy, atrial enlargement. So this is where we're going to stop this presentation. I hope this has been helpful. Please reach out if you have any questions, and I'll make an effort to make more of these in the future if the teaching style proves valuable to people. So give me feedback on this. Let me know if this is useful, and we'll go from there. And thank you for your time.